There's a famous story about British scientist William Thomson. You may know him better as Lord Kelvin, the father of thermodynamics. On April 27, 1900, just a few months into a new century, he gave a speech at the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And one quote in particular has been repeated many times since. "There is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement." It's a massively ironic statement, because that same year, Max Planck would solve the black body radiation problem that led directly to the founding of quantum mechanics. And 5 years later, Albert Einstein would publish his first paper on relativity. But would it surprise you to hear that Kelvin never said anything like this? Kelvin never predicted the end of physics, and in fact, if you listen to his speech, he specifically identifies 2 remaining clouds that were left hovering over the tree of physics. And as it happens, those 2 clouds would turn out to be quantum mechanics and relativity. Fields that, to this day, have only led to further and further branches on the tree of physics, with no end in sight. Kelvin wasn't perfect. He saw no future in hot air balloons and airplanes, but it's this urban legend that has unfairly stuck to his reputation the longest. Some historians believe that the origin of this urban legend comes from 6 years earlier, when an American scientist, Albert Michelson, claimed in a speech that the great principles had already been discovered, and that physics would henceforth be limited to finding truths in the 6th decimal place. Now, in fairness to Michelson here, he'd always been more of an experimentalist than a theorist, and some historians argue that he was more so making the case for further investments in scientific equipment. Because if you don't have precise enough equipment, you don't really know what it is you don't know. What we can gather from this anecdote is that it's a recurring sentiment in human history where we feel close to the end, close to figuring out the final mysteries of the universe, only to tug at a thread that unravels a dozen new questions. In 1911, Ernest Rutherford was firing alpha particles at gold atoms and discovered something amazing. Atoms are almost entirely empty space, with the exception being an extremely small but extremely heavy nucleus. Many years later, reflecting on these results, Rutherford said, "It was quite the most incredible event that has ever happened to me in my life. It was almost as incredible as if you fired a 15-inch shell at a piece of tissue paper and it came back and hit you." Particle accelerators had not been invented yet, and they wouldn't be for another 18 years. But Rutherford had just reinforced the great human tradition of smashing things together and seeing what happens. There have been dozens of days that humans have announced the end of physics. Maybe one day, one of them will be right. After a decade of planning and 2 presidential elections, the digging for the SSC's tunnels was finally going to begin. But almost immediately, 2 disasters struck, one physical in nature and one PR. Just days after Clinton's inauguration, a portion of a tunnel collapsed during construction, killing a worker. Tunneling on that section was immediately halted pending an investigation, while a section with stabler geology continued to be worked on. 2 months later, Roy Schwitters, director of the SSC, had spent much of his busy week being interviewed by reporter Malcolm Brown. In a lapse of judgment, likely brought on by overwork and frustration, Schwitters loudly complained about congressional interference in the project, something he wouldn't have done if he remembered that a New York Times reporter was nearby. "We should be devoting ourselves to completing the machine as rapidly and cheaply as possible, and get on with real science. Instead, our time and energy are being sapped by bureaucrats and politicians. The SSC is becoming a victim of the revenge of the C students." When the quote hit the papers, it was instantly damaging, and Roy Schwitters quickly became the cliché of the arrogant and pretentious physicist who felt entitled to billions of taxpayer dollars. It was an omen that business as usual would not play well in this new political era. The election of Bill Clinton was not necessarily a bad sign for the SSC, but it also wasn't a good one either. On the campaign trail, Clinton had expressed his support for the project, but it was the kind of half-hearted conditional support you give to projects that aren't really the focus of your political platform.
Then there are some programs that I think are quite central to our economy that require us to continue to fund them. Many are controversial with those who don't benefit from them, but I believe in some of them. I'll tell you a couple I believe in. I think that we should continue to fund the Superconducting Super Collider because I think it's good science, even though it's expensive.
That is the voice of a man who could not care less about this project. He's talking about it like a dad who has to pay for piano lessons for his kid who clearly does not like piano lessons.
Clinton's unofficial campaign slogan, "It's the economy, stupid," had won him the election, and his priorities were set accordingly. Although it started under Bush, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, would be continued under Clinton and would take up much of Clinton's time during his first year in office. No, when it came to science, Bill was more than happy to delegate to his right-hand man, Vice President Al Gore, who had served on the Science and Tech Committee in the Senate. And if you know anything about Al Gore, it shouldn't be surprising that the Clinton admin shifted research priorities towards renewable energy, climate change, and environmental research. Other winners under this new admin were bio and medical research, and basically anything with a short-term economic payoff. This unfortunately came at the expense of basic physics research, which included the SSC. Al Gore was instead pushing for a variety of smaller projects under the DOE budget: an advanced neutron source in Oak Ridge, the tokamak plasma experiment at Princeton, and a bee factory to be constructed at Cornell or SLAC. And finally, he was pushing to keep Fermilab's main injector upgrade alive, which you may remember from last time was a major sticking point for the state of Illinois in Congress. The SSC had spent years draining funding from other smaller projects, and now the reverse was happening. Also worth noting, with no obvious military threats on the horizon, the military budget would be on the decline for the foreseeable future, although it never got back down to Jimmy Carter levels. Clinton even made changes to the proportions of federal R&D as well. Instead of the absurd 40-60 split of civil versus military under the Bush admin, Clinton went so far as to reduce the split to an even 50-50. Very on brand for Democrats. He promised to keep everything mostly the same, but with exactly 10% less war. As for the DOE top dog, Admiral Watkins was no longer the Secretary of Energy. Despite his disagreements with the project management, he had been a fierce ally of the project, and losing his support in Congress would be a huge hurdle to overcome. But his influence didn't disappear completely. His pals from the military-industrial complex, Cipriano and Siskin, were still firmly embedded in the management chain at the SSC, for better or for worse. Watkins' replacement was Hazel O'Leary, a lawyer from the Carter admin who specialized in energy policy. Her appointment reflected the new priorities of Clinton and Al Gore. The SSC in high-energy physics was not a presidential priority. Rather, her appointment was intended to help address climate change and nuclear weapons cleanup. That's not to say she wasn't going to at least try to help the SSC. There was still the matter of foreign funding, and although Bush had failed to get Japan to sign on, there was still hope. To kickstart talks, in February, O'Leary had her staff draft a letter to the Japanese PM. Except this letter was never sent, because Clinton had already sent a letter discussing the economy, and Clinton's science advisor refused to approve another one. Another attempt to send a letter was blocked a month later, but this time by the National Security Council. They worried that it would send the message that the SSC was more important than trade relations and financial aid to Russia. And so, SSC allies turned their focus on the first ever summit between Clinton and Miyazawa. An in-person presidential request could still make some magic happen. In preparation for this summit, an A-list team of physicists ended up making a visit to Washington where they spoke with Al Gore, who assured them that the SSC was a top priority for the administration. Apparently, this didn't translate into the talks with Clinton, who focused almost entirely on the ongoing trade war with Japan over automobile parts. So again, the US refused to give a clear presidential endorsement, and Japan, again, responded by just not giving them money. Funny how that works. However, even in the off chance that Japan signed onto the project, it was beginning to look like any amount of money would be far too little, far too late. To get the project back on schedule, it was estimated that $2.3 billion would be required for fiscal year 1994. In the best case scenario, Congress might approve half of that. There were some in the Clinton White House urging to cut their losses and kill the project altogether. In particular, the newly promoted Leon Panetta. If you remember from earlier, he was the budget hawk who helped force the vote that nearly took out the SSC last summer. But other advisors hatched a plan that would hopefully keep the project alive. Rather than keeping to the original construction schedule, they would stretch out the project by 3 or 4 years. This would add to the cost by at least $2 billion, finally pushing it over the $20 billion mark. But the critical factor would be that the yearly costs would go down, and smaller yearly costs would have a much better chance at making it through Congress. A delayed collider was much better than no collider at all. The atmosphere at the Waxahachie lab site was one of urgency and determination. With budget season looming over the horizon, there was a push to get as much built and completed as possible. Maybe if they showed some progress, Congress would be kinder to them. and after the accidental death just a few months prior, 6 kilometers of tunneling had been completed. Late last year, the magnet test lab had just finished construction, as had the linear accelerator portion of the injection sequence. The superconducting magnets, which had been a constant financial drain on the project, were finally robust enough for a manufacturing run. Soon, they'd be pumped out in the thousands. And finally, the DOE had approved construction for one of 2 major detectors. This detector alone was projected to cost around $1 billion, and yet the DOE had only allocated $1 billion for both detectors. I think it's fair to say that those in Waxahachie were living in a different world. One detached from the financial concerns of the rest of the country. One where the SSC's success hinged on just how much they wanted it. They'd already sunk so many years and so much money into it. What else could they do but work their asses off? The SSC's fate was never in their hands, but I'm sure it felt like it was. June 23rd. The House is once again voting on whether to cancel America's most expensive scientific gigaproject. After the nail-biter that was 1992's budget vote, hopes were not high. This Congress was full of eager freshman members who had budget bloodlust. Both Democrats and Republicans were elected on campaign promises to reduce the deficit, slash big government spending to help put more money in the pocket of the American taxpayer. And so, the votes are coming in. It lived. It's still alive. A vote margin of 1 is as slim as it gets. Although not uncommon in the Senate, it's absurdly unlikely in the House. Just the stuff of divine intervention. Well, maybe not divine, but certainly an intervention from a higher power. It turns out both Al Gore and Bill Clinton had spent the previous night making desperate one-on-one phone calls with individual representatives, doing all they could to sway their votes. And against all odds, they succeeded by 1 single vote. It couldn't have been written any more perfectly. And that's why I hate to do this. I need to pull the rug out now. You knew it couldn't be true. You knew this was coming. I couldn't resist one last fake out. This wasn't the vote count for the SSC. It was the vote count for the ISS, the International Space Station, aka the other multi-billion-dollar gigaproject that was hemorrhaging money. It lived to see another day by the skin of its teeth. Remember the old space station freedom idea back in the Reagan days? Well, that idea was a money pit that underwent 7 redesigns before ultimately being scrapped. The ISS concept revived the project, but there is a critical difference now. With the Cold War officially over, NASA and the Russian Space Agency had agreed to pool their funds, in addition to contributions from Canada, Europe, and Japan. But even then, it was not a sure thing. The ISS received harsh criticism from scientists. The ISS wasn't space science, it was space hardware, a $200 billion piece of hardware unlikely to teach humanity anything new beyond some basic anti-gravity research.
Dr. Bluebergen up at Harvard said microgravity research is of micro importance. You can do microgravity research right here on Earth and save yourselves $100 billion.
And yet, the image of astronauts from several nations living and working 420 kilometers above the Earth is too compelling not to pursue. Clinton's rationale should be obvious. If the US gave up on the ISS, it would have meant a huge political fallout from several angry nations who were committed to funding it, as well as nearly 75,000 American jobs disappearing. Clinton was not having an easy first year in office. Although he had won the election, he had been accused of marital infidelity on the campaign trail. In late 1993, Don't Ask, Don't Tell would succeed in pissing off both the left and right sides of the aisle. His healthcare reform bill, spearheaded by First Lady Hillary Clinton, was deeply unpopular with Republicans, and even his own party was split on it. Democrats to his right and left criticized the plan as misguided. Furthermore, his economic stimulus bill was being filibustered by Senate Republicans. Clinton already lacked the influence to push through his main campaign promises. It's not a surprise then that if he had to choose between support for one science gigaproject, he'd choose the one that was splitting the cost between several nations. So on June 24th, the very next day, when the SSC came up to a vote, the result was exactly what you'd expect. The total was 280 to 150, a 130-seat margin to kill the SSC. The House was going to be heard, and you do not ignore the will of the House. And just like last time, it would come down to the Senate. Clinton had predicted this path. I always anticipated that if we were going to save the Super Collider, we would fight for it in conference. But this would be a much tougher fight than in 1992. Members of the House remembered what happened last time, how they were strong-armed by the Senate, how they had used their energy and water budget to take hostages. The House wasn't going to get played a second time, so Representative John Dingell, a prominent SSC critic and member of the Northeast Midwest Alliance, played one of the few cards they had left. He demanded a televised hearing in front of his Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee. He was going to turn the DOE inside out and get to the bottom of the mismanagement and general buffoonery that plagued the SSC. Dingell was a skilled interrogator, notorious for going after scientists for any misuse of taxpayer funding. This intense 9-hour hearing would prove to be a PR nightmare for the SSC. Dingell stated that the SSC ranks among the worst projects we have seen in terms of contract mismanagement and failed government oversight. SSC management was reamed out for the delays in getting a cost management software up and running, and it would emerge that the total magnet cost might reach $5.2 billion, double what had been estimated. Energy Secretary O'Leary was hit particularly hard during questioning. She blamed the management structure put in place under Admiral Watkins, with Cipriano basically removing all control from Schwitters. But she also lambasted the physicists too, arguing they couldn't be trusted to run things on their own, and she vowed to wrestle away any construction responsibilities away from them. Following the hearing, a full audit of the project finances was performed, with generous estimates saying the final cost would be $20 billion, and the worst case ones saying $24 billion. This was before any cost increases from the proposed stretch-out. Gosh, do you remember the days when $8 billion seemed like a lot? With the SSC's future in jeopardy, Texas panicked and held back nearly $80 million in funding, leading to Director Schwitters having to cut costs left and right. It led to over 300 layoffs. It didn't help that Schwitters and Cipriano had become even more dysfunctional. They were no longer on speaking terms. This came after a Washington Post article where they published a private memo where Cipriano recommended that Schwitters be fired. Senator Bennett Johnson, in an effort to paint the project in a better light, held a less adversarial hearing in the Senate. Dale Bumpers yet again introduced his amendment to kill the SSC.
Now, the senator wants to challenge the $20 billion figure, I guess.
That's right.
Okay. We've been through this so many times, I know what you're thinking before you say it. And I'll just simply say, we're not to $20 billion yet, but we're not to $13 billion yet either, but we know we're headed there. You got to be eating and smoking something awful strong to believe that this is the last word.
I mean, are we going to just let this country sink slowly like the sun in the west at evening tide and say we can't compete anymore, we have no more scientific curiosity, we have no scientific competitiveness? We're going to let this budget deficit fueled by entitlements just overwhelm us?
The votes came in. $57-42 to save the SSC. The Senate had come through yet again, albeit with the worst margin so far. The SSC was losing allies left and right. Round 1 went to the House. Round 2 went to the Senate. The ultimate fate of the SSC will be decided in round 3. The House and Senate were going to meet in a conference committee yet again. Would a compromise be made and the SSC live on, or would the House get its way? Boehlert and Slattery, the perpetual enemies of the SSC in the House, anticipated a repeat of the dirty tactic used in the 1992 budget vote. The House and Senate Compromise Committee was likely to be filled only by members of the Appropriations Committees, almost all of whom were SSC allies. The two of them rallied to get SSC opponents included, but the Speaker of the House ignored them, citing precedent. So how exactly do you compromise between a Senate who wants $1.2 billion and a House who wants, $0? Well, at least according to the Compromise Committee, you give them the full $1.2 billion. You can imagine that this enraged much of the House. It was one thing to keep funding the SSC, but it was an outright insult to award it the full budget request. And once again, just like last time, the SSC's budget wasn't on its own. It was surrounded by an entire year's worth of water and energy funding that goes directly towards local district projects. Hostage-taking at its finest. If the House truly wanted to kill the SSC, they had to be prepared to also kill the rest of the energy budget. But actually, no. Jim Slattery refused to accept this, and so introduced a motion to explicitly order the Compromise Committee to delete SSC funding from their budget report. And so, the House members, sick and tired of being made out to be fools, voted overwhelmingly in favor of the motion. 282 to 143. The hostage analogy kind of breaks down here, so I'm gonna do my best. It's kind of like everyone in town agreed that you should let the hostages go, and then you got sniped in the head. 115 Republicans and 166 Democrats made their opinions clear. The SSC had to stand on its own. When the actual final bill came to a vote, the House made its will known. 332 to 81. The SSC was dead. It ends here. Shut it down. The Senate, knowing they were defeated, agreed 89 to 11. For 114 freshman members of Congress, this was their first time voting on the SSC. 82 of them voted to kill it. If the House demands it, it will find a way.
George Bush once compared the Super Collider to the pyramids of Giza. He of course meant it in the wonders of the world sense. And in a, ironic twist of fate, his words still kind of hold true. The Super Collider is not a world wonder, but it is a tomb.
Following the fateful House vote that ultimately killed it, Senator Johnson and Congressman Bevel held a conference committee in a last-ditch effort to save the program, during which they begged and pleaded with Boehlert and Slattery. This begging and pleading led to an almost comical compromise. The SSC got to keep its $1.2 billion budget. The catch was that it could only be used to shut the project down. US Congress had just approved the most expensive funeral in world history. In a quote that is extremely insensitive, coming from a man from Louisiana, Senator Johnson would tell reporters that the SSC has been lynched and we have to bury the body.
When the SSC was officially killed in Congress, only 22 kilometers of tunneling had been complete, just a little more than a quarter of the total loop.
In total, $3.85 billion had been spent. The reactions from the academic community were bleak. Leon Lederman described it as a tragedy for the field and everyone in it. The government decided, in its wisdom, that high-energy physics has no future.
The day after the House vote that killed the SSC, our old friend, Burton Richter, received a phone call from Senator Bennett Johnson's chief of staff. It was over. There was no coming back from this. Sitting across from Richter was John Peebles, the current director of Fermilab. For the past month, he'd been quietly asked by several DOE officials if he'd be willing to step in and replace Roy Schwitters in a last-ditch attempt to save the project. At this point, he couldn't save the SSC. It would be the equivalent of becoming captain after the Titanic hit the iceberg. But, at the very least, he could prevent it from taking down America's other labs along with it.
When the Congress voted to terminate the funding for the SSC project, I realized it'd be very important that this be done well, both for URA, which also runs Fermilab, of which I'm director, and for the whole high-energy physics community. The people who built this laboratory had struggled very, very hard to try to bring it to completion against really difficult odds. I mean, if you had to pick a time to build a laboratory, at the end of the Cold War, it was not a good time.
Some worried that Schwitters would view the move as a coup, but he didn't put up a fight. In his resignation letter, he stated that he came to the URA in Texas to build the SSC, and that is no longer possible. He felt uncomfortable and inexperienced in the role of funeral director. After 5 years, every original name on this management chart had left the project. His departure would help reduce tensions at the Waxahachie site. Following the nasty televised hearings where Secretary O'Leary had thrown Schwitters under the bus, their relationship had become extremely bitter. removing him was a welcome move for all parties. Although you would think that shutting a project down would be much easier than starting it, there was still a tangled mess of delicate issues to resolve. The most politically sensitive issue was how to deal with Texas. Texas Governor Ann Richards was livid. She had tried to get Bill Clinton to veto the cancellation, but multiple sources have indicated that he gave her an ultimatum. It's either the SSC or the space station, two major projects that Texas had business ties to. The choice at that point was basically already made, so instead she demanded that the DOE reimburse them $1.2 billion for what they had already invested, in addition to $519 million for any new research that could be carried out at the Waxahachie site. But given the Congress had only given $1.2 billion total for the entire project shutdown, that reimbursement appeared to be impossible. Despite this, it was the opinion of the White House that Texas should be repaid, not only because of the potentially nasty legal and political consequences, but also because, and I quote here, it's the right thing to do. In the end, Texas had invested about $1 billion in cash and assets, and received back $393 million in cash and $956 million in land and facilities, as fair a deal as they could hope for given the circumstances. By early 1994, those who were left at the lab said it's like working in a morgue. The initial termination benefits for all the laid-off employees were apparently so harsh that some people feared for Secretary O'Leary's safety if she attended a meeting with thousands of about-to-be-fired workers. O'Leary met with John Peoples to discuss the termination benefits, and Peoples pushed hard for better terms. Later, in the eventual all-hands meeting, she dramatically ripped up the old contract into shreds. Everyone was going to be taken care of. John Peoples, she stated, is a guy who knows how to run something. In a clever move, Peoples realized that they could use some of the remaining budget to provide advanced computer training to the soon-to-be unemployed workers. This allowed many of them to quickly find jobs in Dallas, saving the DOE around $300 million in unemployment benefits. As for the remaining buildings and infrastructure, Governor Richards put together a committee to plan future research projects. The magnet lab could be used pretty much as is, and the magnets could go towards any future colliders. The linear accelerator, on the other hand, had potential use in development of radioactive cancer treatment labs. The computer infrastructure could easily be turned into an advanced computing lab. Non-physics proposals included turning the site into a prairie restoration project or using the tunnels for geology studies. In the end, however, none of these projects ever happened. Congress debated funding for all of them, but literally every single one was deemed too expensive to be worth it. Magnet lab? Too expensive. Cancer research? There's no nearby medical facilities. Geology studies? The tunnels were filled with water and sealed off. I can't put an optimistic spin on this. So much money was wasted for no reason. The only positive outcome was that 10 school districts and 1 university received the leftover tech equipment. That's it. Like many Democrats, Texas Governor Ann Richards lost her re-election bid in the Republican Revolution of 1994. But I should stress, like everything else in this story, her loss can't be chalked up to just one cause. The SSC collapsing didn't lose her the election, but it certainly didn't help. The GOP could have put literally any no-name in a suit and they probably would have won. And the man they chose wasn't exactly a no-name. To date, she is the last Democrat to ever hold the office of Texas governor. By this point, John Peoples had effectively been running 2 labs, the SSC and Fermilab, and he was at his limit. He resigned in the summer of 1994. Unexpectedly, American particle physics would stumble on to one last major discovery. Fermilab had found evidence of the top quark. The 6th and final quark was detected, with its mass matching up perfectly with theory. Fermilab, even with its 30-year-old tech, had one last breakthrough under its belt. With that, it was official. All 6 quarks had been discovered in America. When the SSC was cancelled, it meant minor good news for a few smaller labs. SLAC got $69 million for its B factory, Oak Ridge could start its advanced neutron source with $33 million, and finally, Fermilab got $48 million for its main injector upgrade. The US wasn't going to lead particle physics for much longer, but at least for the next 10 years, Fermilab would remain relevant. In the years since, Waxahachie has considered a number of non-science projects to make some of their money back. A wind tunnel, an exotic mushroom farm, 6 Flags under Texas. Decades earlier, Waxahachie had been the filming location for a few westerns, and in a poetic example of history repeating itself, the SSC site was used as a film set for Jean-Claude Van Damme's Universal Soldier, and the stupid yet amazing show, Prison Break. After nearly 10 years of unuse, in 2006, a comically Texan multimillionaire named Johnny Brian Hunt finally bought the site. Hunt was well known for having a hand in a dozen different business areas, and he planned to bring his newest venture, data storage, to Waxahachie. I don't think there's ever been another human being who has ever been this excited about data storage as this man. I'm always dealing in things I know nothing about. What turns me on is when 20 of your best friends tell you it won't work. I think that does something to me. In a final cruel twist of fate, as if the site was cursed, Hunt slipped on a patch of ice and hit his head on the pavement. He died from injuries a few days later. The data center project ended with him. Later, a chemical manufacturer known as MagnaBlend purchased the land in 2012. Although if you believe the YouTube comments, they're just a facade, and the tunnels are actually being used as a series of bunkers for the global elite. As a tribute, MagnaBlend named their new facility the Specialty Services Complex. The SSC name, at least in spirit, lives on. I told you this story doesn't have a happy ending, and I guess that's true if you only focus on the American perspective. Pretty much the same day the SSC was cancelled, American physicists knew that the future of multi-TeV physics lay in Europe, and thus began the slow bureaucratic process to get the US a seat at the table. CERN and their new Large Hadron Collider, or LHC, was the way forward. For most of you, I think you know how this story ends. But even then, the LHC was never guaranteed to succeed and did indeed face several catastrophic hurdles that could have led to the same fate as the SSC. The fact that it did succeed in spite of those hurdles is worth celebrating and worth learning from. The LHC concept is much older than you might expect, with plans first forming in 1984. In the usual European fashion, however, the plans were much less ambitious and involved a multi-stage upgrade process. The first stage was to build the LEP, the Large Electron Positron Collider. Perhaps you remember, CERN director Herbert Schopper testified in front of Congress in 1987, begging the Americans to join up with them, to no avail. The LEP was completed in 1989 with a ring circumference of 27 kilometers. The LEP could collide low-mass leptons up to 0.2 TeV, but to break through the multi-TeV barrier, they would need to support heavier particles, and thus Stage 2 was going to use hadrons, aka any particle consisting of 2 or more quarks. So already, maybe you see a couple advantages the LHC had over the SSC. First, a unified governing body of 19 countries instead of just one. One nation on its own, no matter how wealthy or powerful, can do this alone anymore. The physical scale is too vast, the costs too outlandish to be shouldered by one country. And secondly, the LHC had a much smaller scope that could reuse existing infrastructure, i.e. an already constructed tunnel and a chain of proton injectors. Here, it's hard not to draw the comparison to Fermilab. If the SSC had been built at an existing lab, with an existing technical and human infrastructure, how much could have been saved on construction? With the benefit of hindsight, many in the field have come to the understanding that the SSC's design was flawed, and that even if it got built, the LHC could still rival it in performance. In the 1980s, when the SSC was designed, the general consensus was that the only variable that mattered was max energy. Hence why they chose the gargantuan 40 TeV and massive footprint. To be competitive, the much smaller LHC loop would have to compensate by maxing out a different variable, luminosity, aka the number of collisions per second. A single high-energy collision on its own doesn't mean much, because you can't distinguish it from background noise. You want to crank up the luminosity until you've got hundreds of millions of collisions per second. The SSC, for a variety of reasons, would have had a garbage luminosity, so it was here where the LHC would have had the edge. Despite having 19 member nations, there was still a period of doubt where it seemed like the LHC might not get funded. CERN's member states contribute a yearly amount based on a set percentage of their GDP. Germany in particular was a central figure in CERN, being a country with considerable wealth and a long history of leadership in particle physics. But the 90s were a time of major upheaval for Germany. The slow unification of East and West Germany was costing hundreds of billions in euros each year, so it should come as no surprise that Germany was requesting a reduction in their yearly contribution. With one of CERN's key financial backers pulling out and the UK hesitant to commit, France and Switzerland had to up their contributions, given that the CERN campus was actually built across their borders. And in the meantime, the man picked to manage the project, Lyndon Evans, was devising a clever plan to keep costs down and convince Germany to stay on board. He proposed a two-stage missing magnet scheme, where 33% of the magnets wouldn't be installed at first. This would lower the total energy output from 14 to 10 TeV, but the costs would be lowered accordingly.
Germany ended up agreeing to the missing magnet proposal, but in the end, that wasn't necessary. By 1995, Japan had signed on to CERN as a non-member observing nation. This basically means you contribute money and scientists to CERN, but without council voting rights. This would soon be followed by contributions from Canada, India, Israel, and Russia, each of whom would contribute a component to the detectors. And in 1997, Bill Clinton finally did what Reagan should have done all the way back in 1987. The United States signed on to CERN as an observer nation, agreeing to give at least $917 million. The LHC now had the money to go all out. It'd be built in just one stage, with all its magnets, with a target end date of 2005. The total cost? 3.7 billion Swiss francs, about $4 billion US dollars. Now that's a much easier pill to swallow than 24 billion, huh? Of course, things didn't go as smoothly as predicted. Again, just like the SSC, the most expensive and troublesome part of the project would be the magnets, specifically 1,232 superconducting dipoles. They would need to be operated at 1.9 Kelvin and could support absurdly strong fields of 8 Teslas, surpassing the SSC's 6.6 Teslas. Development on these took nearly a full decade. For this reason, among others, a review of the project finances in 2001 revealed that they were nearly 850 million francs over budget, which is almost 1 billion US. The council members of CERN were incredulous and ordered a management review. Many feared that Evans, with his one-on-one small picture management style, would be fired. However, the review team acknowledged that Evans understood the project at a deep technical level and his staff was loyal to him, so he was allowed to stay on. It's hard not to draw comparisons to Maury Tigner here. If he had stayed on as project manager, he may have seen the SSC through to its completion. Instead, the SSC had seen a revolving door of 6 separate project managers, some only staying on for months at a time. It also helped that unlike the SSC, which had no way to effectively keep track of cost overruns, CERN did. Their software program tracked everything from systems, subsystems down to individual components, and was powered by the World Wide Web that CERN had a hand in creating. So when politicians came knocking with budget questions, Evans could point out exactly where the problem was. Lyndon Evans would see the project through to its eventual completion in 2008. There were delays, sure, but the LHC is possibly the most complex scientific instrument in existence. The fact that this got done at all is a testament to decades of planning, the cooperation of thousands of scientists, and the financial support of a couple dozen nations. Maybe you remember the day the LHC came online for the first time, in September of 2008. But you probably don't remember that 9 days later, Lyndon Evans received a panicked phone call informing him of a near disaster. Multiple magnets had quenched, meaning that faulty electrical connections had warmed and the magnets were no longer superconducting. The melted connections caused a huge spark, releasing nearly 6 tons of helium gas. In the investigation that followed, it was found that 80 of the 10,000 electrical connections were faulty and would have to be replaced. Evans and the rest of CERN had a difficult choice to make. Option A. They could do a partial, quick and easy repair in 1 year and try and get some data, but they wouldn't be able to operate at the max energy, lest they risk another fatal meltdown. Option B. Do a full repair, pushing back experiments by multiple years. They decided that there had been enough waiting. It was time to do some physics. They did the partial repairs, and the LHC finally had its first collision on November 23, 2009. The LHC was running at half its design energy, which was still a lot, but its luminosity was garbage. The initial repairs had made the LHC functional again, but it would take multiple years of calibration to get its luminosity back up to full health. With the LHC temporarily out of commission, CERN faced an unexpected challenger. Now, you would think by this point that American particle physics had largely accepted its fate as a sidekick to CERN, but not quite so. SLAC had found the tau neutrino in the year 2000, and the Fermilab Tevatron eventually did get its main injector upgrade finished in 2001. And in the intervening years, there had been some exciting evidence that you could produce a Higgs particle at a much smaller mass than first anticipated. Masses small enough that even the much weaker Tevatron had a shot at finding the Higgs. And so for nearly a decade, they struggled and struggled, because their luminosity was also not good enough. So far, all they had managed to do was help narrow the search region, crossing off 156 to 177 GeV. And they weren't just racing CERN, they were also racing a deadline. The Tevatron was scheduled to be permanently shut down in September of 2011. The 2008 financial crash had thrown the entire country for a loop, and particle physics wasn't exactly on the top of Obama's priority list. Despite this, Fermilab scientists campaigned for $180 million to keep the Tevatron running for 3 more years, and they were willing to cut back on the rest of the lab's activities to pay for it. But Secretary Stephen Chu had different priorities for the DOE budget, with renewables once again taking precedence. The Tevatron shut down as scheduled in September of 2011. They knew it was a long shot, they didn't know if they would find the Higgs, but they wanted to at least try. And with that, it was the end of an era. Cornell and SLAC both shut down their colliders in 2008, leaving only Brookhaven with the last major American collider. Another factor in CERN's favor here was the time period. Computing power in the 2010s was leagues ahead of computing power in the early 2000s. And when your machine spits out 300 gigabytes of data per second, that makes a huge difference. Purely from a data crunching perspective, CERN was saving months, if not years of time. A decade head start with the SSC may really have just been a couple years at most. During this period, rumors and false alarms of a Higgs detection were beginning to circulate, but all they could say confidently was that the Higgs mass wasn't between 145 GeV and 466 GeV. According to the standard model, that left one place left to look, between 114 GeV and 145. As 2011 turned into 2012, that region narrowed, 116 to 130. As thousands of scientists poured over months of data, a spike began to emerge. 4 separate experiments were saying something was appearing at 125 GeV. For some scientists, this all but confirmed it. The numbers were crunched, and the chance that this was just noise were only 1 in 3 million. This was it, the first major discovery of the LHC, a particle that was consistent with the Higgs boson. Leon Lederman, who I've been incorrectly calling Leon Lederman, originally wrote his book The God Particle in 1993 as a way to drum up public support for the floundering SSC project, which was cancelled just months later. In 2006, he released a second edition of his book, and he added a preface, acknowledging that it was kind of awkward that the original premise relied on a non-existent collider. And yet, it was just shy of 2 years before the LHC would be up and running. This new instrument will not be surrounded by the friendly folks in Waxahachie, but will be located in Geneva, Switzerland, which has fewer good rib restaurants, but more fondue, and is easier to spell and pronounce. After days of cautious internal celebration, the director of CERN officially made the announcement that they had found the Higgs boson. They announced it on the 4th of July.